Katherine Turner clutched the edge of the wagon as it rattled down the dusty trail toward the Silver Peak mining camp, her wrists raw from the rope bindings, and her heart heavier than the ore they'd soon force her to sort. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been a wife, preparing supper in her modest home in Calico, California. Now she was cargo, sold by the man who had vowed to cherish her, traded for gambling debts and whiskey money to the mining company that treated women like equipment. The year was 1876, and the California mining towns were desperate for workers, any workers. The mining companies didn't care where they came from or how they got there. The wagon jolted over a rock, sending pain shooting through Katherine's already bruised body. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. She wouldn't give the driver the satisfaction of hearing her pain. "Almost there, Mrs. Turner," the driver called back, a cruel amusement in his voice. "Your new home awaits. 5 years of service should cover what your husband owed Mr. Blackwell. If you survive that long." Katherine closed her eyes against the setting sun. Thomas Turner had seemed like salvation when he'd courted her 3 years ago, handsome, charming, with promises of a good life in the boom town of Calico. She'd been 20 and naive, the daughter of a shopkeeper who died and left nothing but debts. Thomas had paid those debts, married her, and brought her west. She never imagined he'd sell her to cover his own. The wagon crested a hill, revealing the sprawling mining camp below a collection of rough wooden structures, ore carts, and the dark mouths of mine shafts puncturing the mountainside like wounds. Thin wisps of smoke rose from campfires where men gathered, their faces turned toward the approaching wagon with hungry interest. "Fresh meat," one of the guards riding alongside muttered, and the others laughed. Katherine's stomach twisted. She had heard stories of women in the mining camps, how few lasted more than a year before disease, abuse, or despair claimed them. How they were passed among the men like bottles of whiskey. Her fingers found the small silver locket hidden in the folds of her dress, the last gift from her mother. Inside was a pressed flower and a scrap of paper with a Bible verse. It was all she had left of her former life. The wagon rolled to a stop before a large tent with a crudely painted sign. Silver Peak Mining Company. 2 armed men stepped forward, eyeing Katherine like she was a horse at auction. "This the Turner woman?" one asked. The driver nodded, jumping down from his seat. "Paid fair and square. Mr. Blackwell says she's to work sorting ore and laundry, says she's got educated hands, can read and write too." "Educated hands," the taller guard sneered, reaching for Katherine's arm to pull her from the wagon. "We'll see what those hands are good for." Before he could touch her, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them all turn. A rider on a tall chestnut stallion approached at a steady pace, silhouetted against the dying sun. The guards straightened, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The rider pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Dust covered his leather vest and denims, and a star-shaped badge glinted on his chest. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I'm looking for Mr. Blackwell." "He's inside, Marshal," the driver said, suddenly respectful. "Just delivering this one to the camp, all proper and legal." The marshal tilted his head, and for the first time his gaze met Katherine's. Even in the fading light, she could see his eyes were a startling blue, clear and steady as a mountain stream. Something flickered in those eyes as he took in her bound wrists, the bruises on her face, the terror she couldn't hide. "Legal, you say?" he asked, not looking away from Katherine. "I'd like to see those papers." Marshal Dawson, a new voice called. A portly man emerged from the large tent, wiping his hands on a kerchief. "Didn't expect to see you this evening. What brings you to our humble operation?" Jackson Dawson finally broke his gaze from Katherine's and turned to the mine owner. "Mr. Blackwell, just passing through, heard you acquired a new worker." Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just business, Marshal. Her husband owed a considerable debt. She's working it off fair and square." "I see." The marshal's voice was neutral, but Katherine saw his jaw tighten. How much is this debt, exactly? Blackwell named a sum that made Katherine's head spin. It was far more than Thomas could have possibly owed, even with his reckless gambling. That's quite a sum, Marshal Dawson said, reaching into his vest pocket. I believe I'll settle it. A stunned silence fell over the group. Katherine couldn't breathe as she watched the marshal count out bills and gold pieces, placing them in Blackwell's suddenly trembling hands. This woman is free to go, Marshal Dawson said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned to Katherine, stepping close to cut the ropes binding her wrists. His hands were gentle but calloused, a working man's hands. What game are you playing, Dawson? Blackwell demanded, though he'd quickly pocketed the money. No game, the marshal replied, helping Katherine down from the wagon. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, weak from fear and the long journey. The marshal's strong arm steadied her. Just couldn't stand by and watch. She's your problem now, Blackwell spat, turning to go back into his tent. Don't come crying when you find out what kind of woman she is. The marshal ignored him, instead turning his attention fully to Katherine. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar near his temple, the dark stubble on his jaw. He wasn't handsome in the way Thomas had been. There was nothing soft or pretty about him, but there was something in his face that spoke of strength and, surprisingly, kindness. "Can you ride, Mrs. Turner?" he asked quietly. Katherine nodded, finding her voice at last. "Yes, and it's Katherine." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Jackson Dawson, friends call me Jack." He guided her toward his horse. "We should get moving before these gentlemen change their minds about our arrangement." With surprising ease, he lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. Katherine sat rigid, unused to such proximity with a stranger, but grateful beyond words for his intervention. "Hold tight," he murmured, and then they were moving, the horse's powerful strides carrying them away from the mining camp and into the gathering darkness. Katherine didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see the place that had almost become her prison. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic hoofbeats, the solid presence of the man behind her, and the overwhelming sense of having been saved from a fate worse than death. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the wind and the horse's movement. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" For a long moment, she thought he hadn't heard her or wouldn't answer. Then his voice came, low and honest, near her ear. "No one deserves to be sold like cattle, least of all a woman who's done nothing wrong but trust the wrong man." Katherine closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair, something dangerously like hope. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Calico first," he replied. "To find your husband." Katherine stiffened. "Thomas is there, last I heard." There was an edge to his voice now. "Man who sells his wife deserves to look her in the eye one last time before she's free of him." Free. The word echoed in Katherine's mind as they rode through the darkness toward Calico. Free, because a stranger, a marshal with kind eyes, had decided her life was worth saving. The town of Calico appeared on the horizon just as dawn was breaking. It was a modest settlement that had sprung up around the silver mines, larger than Silver Peak Camp, but still rough around the edges. The main street was lined with false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various businesses catering to miners and travelers. Katherine hadn't expected to return so soon or under such circumstances. As they rode down the main street, a few early risers stopped to stare. She felt exposed, sitting atop the marshal's horse, her dress dirty and torn, her face bruised. She'd been gone less than a week, but it felt like a lifetime. "Hold your head up," Marshal Dawson said quietly. "You've done nothing wrong." They stopped in front of the sheriff's office, a small wooden building with a jail attached to the back. The marshal dismounted and then helped Katherine down, his hands strong and steady around her waist. For a moment she swayed on her feet, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "Just a bit further," he said, his hand at her elbow guiding her up the steps. Inside, the office was sparse but orderly. A man with a graying mustache looked up from his desk, surprise registering on his weathered face. "Jack, wasn't expecting you back for another week." "Change of plans, Sheriff Miller." Marshal Dawson guided Katherine to a chair. "Is Thomas Turner in town?" The sheriff's eyes darted to Katherine, recognition and then discomfort crossing his features. "Last I saw him, he was celebrating at the lucky strike, seemed to have come into some money." Anger flashed across the marshal's face, there and gone so quickly Katherine might have imagined it. "I need you to find him and bring him here. Tell him his wife is waiting." Sheriff Miller nodded and left without another word. Marshal Dawson moved to a small stove in the corner, pouring water from a pitcher into a kettle and setting it to heat. "You should rest," he said, turning back to Katherine. "It'll be a while before they find him." "I'm fine," Katherine said automatically, though she was anything but. Her body ached, her mind was foggy with exhaustion, and her emotions were a tangled mess of fear, anger, and confusion. The marshal gave her a look that said he didn't believe her for a second. "There's a cot in the back room, clean blankets. You can wash up too. I'll wake you when he's found." Katherine wanted to refuse, to insist on facing Thomas immediately, but her body betrayed her. She nodded, too tired to argue, and followed the marshal to a small room at the back of the office. It was simple but clean: a narrow cot with fresh bedding, a basin with water, a small mirror on the wall. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes, "for everything." Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that went beyond words. The marshal nodded once, then left her alone, closing the door behind him. Katherine moved to the basin, pouring water and washing her face and hands. In the small mirror, she hardly recognized herself, hollow-eyed, pale, with a bruise darkening her cheek where Thomas had struck her before dragging her to the wagon. She touched the mark gently, wondering how she had ever loved the man who had done this to her. She removed her outer dress, using a cloth to wash away the dust and grime of the journey as best she could. Then, exhausted beyond measure, she lay down on the cot and was asleep almost instantly. Katherine woke to a gentle knock on the door. For a moment she didn't know where she was, panic rising in her chest. Then memory returned: the marshal, the rescue, Calico, Mrs. Turner. Marshal Dawson's voice came through the door. "Your husband's here." Katherine sat up, smoothing her dress and hair as best she could. "I'll be right out," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Then she opened the door and walked into the main office. Thomas was sitting in a chair, looking far worse than she remembered. His once handsome face was puffy from drink, his clothes rumpled and stained. When he saw Katherine, his expression shifted from annoyance to shock. "Katie," he said, half rising before Sheriff Miller pushed him back down. "What are you doing here?" "How did you—" "Marshal Dawson paid my debt," Katherine said, her voice cold. "The debt you created when you sold me to the mines." Thomas's eyes darted to the marshal, who stood silent and watchful near the door, his presence somehow reassuring to Katherine. "I didn't sell you," Thomas protested weakly. "I just needed time to get the money together. It was temporary, 5 years, Katherine cut him off. "You sold me for 5 years of servitude in that hellhole, and for what? To cover your gambling debts." Thomas's face hardened. "You're my wife. What's yours is mine. I did what I had to do." "Not anymore," Katherine said, surprised at her own calm. "I want a divorce, Thomas." He laughed, an ugly sound. "A divorce? On what grounds? You're my property, Katie. You go where I say." Marshal Dawson stepped forward then, his voice quiet but with an edge of steel. "Actually, Turner, selling your wife to a mining camp against her will is grounds enough in any court in this territory. Add to that the visible marks of abuse, and you're looking at more than just a divorce." Thomas paled. "You can't prove anything." "I have the bill of sale," the marshal said, pulling a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Signed by you and witnessed by Mr. Blackwell. Very thorough documentation of your transaction." "This is ridiculous," Thomas sputtered, looking desperately at Sheriff Miller. "Frank, you know me. This is my wife. I know what you did, Tom," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "Whole town's talking about it. Ain't right what you did." Ain't legal either. Katherine watched her husband, the man she had once loved, had once thought would protect her, crumble before her eyes. It gave her no pleasure, only a profound sadness and relief that she was seeing him clearly at last. "The divorce papers will be drawn up," Marshal Dawson said. "In the meantime, you'll stay away from Mrs. Turner. You'll turn over her personal belongings and anything that was hers before your marriage, and you'll leave Calico by the end of the week." "You can't run me out of town," Thomas protested. "I'm not," the marshal replied calmly. "But the charges I'll file if you stay might keep you occupied for quite some time, in a cell." Thomas looked from the marshal to Katherine, his expression turning ugly. "You think you're better than me. Where will you go? What will you do? No decent man will have you now." Katherine flinched at the venom in his voice, but before she could respond, Marshal Dawson stepped between them. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made Thomas shrink back. "Sheriff Miller, please escort Mr. Turner to his residence to collect Mrs. Turner's belongings. I'll accompany you both to ensure there's no trouble." As the three men prepared to leave, Katherine found herself alone with her thoughts. The reality of her situation was sinking in. Thomas was right about one thing. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no family, no money, no home of her own. The marshal paused at the door, turning back to her. "Will you be all right here for a bit? I promise we won't be long." Katherine nodded, touched by his concern. "Yes, thank you." After they left, she sank into a chair, the events of the past days catching up with her. She was free, or would be soon, but freedom was a frightening prospect when you had nothing and no one. An hour later, the men returned. Sheriff Miller was carrying a small trunk, which he set down carefully near Katherine. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Katherine asked. "Cooling his heels at the saloon," Sheriff Miller said. Marshal Dawson suggested he might want to start his packing. The marshal stepped forward, holding out a small pouch that clinked with coins. "We found this hidden in a floorboard under your bed." Turner was reluctant to admit it existed, but the sheriff was persuasive. Katherine took the pouch, surprised by its weight. "I don't understand." "It's yours," the marshal said simply. "Money from your father's store that Turner took when you married. He kept records, detailed ones. Seems he was quite proud of his financial acumen." Katherine opened the pouch, staring at the gold and silver coins inside. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. "Thank you," she said, looking up at both men, "for everything." Sheriff Miller nodded awkwardly, then excused himself, saying he had rounds to make. When he was gone, Katherine turned to the marshal. "What happens now?" she asked. Marshal Dawson removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. Without the hat shadowing his features, she could see his face more clearly: the straight nose, the firm jawline, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of long days and longer nights. "That depends on you," he said. "Do you have family you can go to?" Katherine shook her head. "No one. My parents are gone. I have a distant cousin in St. Louis, but we've never met." The marshal nodded, as if he'd expected this answer. "There's a widow in town, Mrs. Parker. She runs a boarding house for respectable women. I can arrange a room for you there until you decide what you want to do next." "Why are you helping me?" Katherine asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd appeared at the mining camp. "You don't know me." "You've already done more than enough by getting me away from Silver Peak." Jackson Dawson looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I've seen what happens to women in mining camps," he said finally. "My younger sister was sold to one by her husband, back in '68. By the time I found her, it was too late." Katherine's heart twisted. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head as if dismissing her sympathy. "I couldn't save her, but I could save you." The simple honesty of his words struck Katherine to her core. This man, this stranger who had already given so much, had done it all because of a sister he couldn't protect. There was no agenda, no expectation of repayment or gratitude. He had simply done what he believed was right. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "Live your life," he replied, a small smile softening his features. "Be happy, that's thanks enough. With that, he put his hat back on and offered her his arm. "Let's get you settled at Mrs. Parker's. You look like you could use a hot meal and a good night's sleep in a real bed." Katherine gathered her trunk and the pouch of coins, then took his arm. As they stepped out into the bright California sunshine, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she was making her own choices, walking her own path. And for now, that path led alongside a marshal with kind eyes, and a burden of his own, a man who had saved her for the sake of a sister he couldn't save, expecting nothing in return. Mrs. Parker's boarding house stood on a quiet side street away from the saloons and gambling halls that dominated much of Calico. It was a well-maintained two-story structure with a wide porch and clean curtains in the windows, a stark contrast to many of the hastily constructed buildings in town. Katherine had never been inside before. Thomas hadn't approved of Mrs. Parker, calling her a meddlesome widow with notions above her station. Now, as Marshal Dawson escorted her up the steps, Katherine wondered what the real story was between her husband and the boarding house owner. A bell tinkled softly as they entered a tidy front parlor. The room was simply but tastefully furnished with comfortable-looking chairs, a small writing desk, and shelves lined with books, a rare sight in a mining town. "Just a moment," called a woman's voice from the back of the house. A minute later, a slender woman in her 40s appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. She had auburn hair streaked with silver, intelligent green eyes, and a no-nonsense expression that softened when she saw the marshal. "Jack Dawson," she said, shaking her head though she was smiling. "Back in Calico already. I wasn't expecting you for another week." "Change of plans, Eliza," he replied, removing his hat. "I've brought someone who needs a room. This is Katherine Turner, Mrs." Parker's smile vanished as her eyes took in Katherine, the bruised face, the worn dress, the small trunk of possessions. Understanding and then anger flickered across her features. "Thomas Turner's wife," she said, not a question but a statement. "I heard rumors, but I didn't want to believe a man would stoop so low." Katherine tensed, unsure what to expect. Would this woman blame her for her husband's actions? Would she turn her away? To her surprise, Mrs. Parker stepped forward and gently took her hand. "You poor dear, you're safe now. We'll get you settled in a nice room and see about some proper food. You look half-starved." "Thank you," Katherine managed, overwhelmed by the woman's immediate kindness. "Marshal Dawson says you might have a room available. Always have room for a woman in need, Mrs." Parker said firmly, shooting the marshal an approving look. "Jack, you can bring her trunk up to the blue room at the end of the hall. It gets the morning sun just what she needs to heal." Without waiting for a response, Mrs. Parker led Katherine toward the stairs. "The washroom is at the end of the hall. Hot water available morning and evening. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. We share the cooking, but you won't have to worry about that for a few days. Just rest and recover." Katherine found herself guided up the stairs and into a small but cheerful room with blue floral wallpaper, a comfortable-looking bed, a small dresser, and a chair near the window that overlooked a garden in the back of the house. "It's lovely," Katherine said honestly. "But I'm not sure how long I can stay. I have some money, but we'll work that out later," Mrs. Parker interrupted gently. "For now, let's get you settled." Marshal Dawson appeared in the doorway with Katherine's trunk, setting it carefully at the foot of the bed. Standing in the small room, he seemed even larger than before, his broad shoulders nearly touching the doorframe. "I should be going," he said, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the feminine space. "Sheriff Miller will need my help with the divorce papers." "Of course," Mrs. Parker said. "Will you join us for dinner tonight, 6 o'clock sharp?" The marshal hesitated, glancing at Katherine. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Mrs. Parker declared. "You saved this young woman from a terrible fate. The least I can do is feed you a decent meal." A small smile touched his lips. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" He turned to Katherine. "Will you be all right here?" There was genuine concern in his eyes, and Katherine found herself touched once again by this man's unexpected kindness. "Yes," she assured him. more than all right. He nodded, replaced his hat, and with a final look that Katherine couldn't quite interpret, left the room. They heard his heavy footsteps descending the stairs, then the soft chime of the bell as he exited the house. "Well, Mrs. Parker said, turning to Katherine with a sympathetic smile, "Let's get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes. I think we're about the same size. Then we'll see about that food I promised." Over the next few hours, Katherine experienced more kindness than she had in years. Mrs. Parker, call me Eliza, dear, helped her bathe and wash her hair, provided a clean dress that fit reasonably well, and fed her a simple but delicious meal of bread, cheese, and vegetable soup. As Katherine ate, Eliza sat across from her at the kitchen table, her expression kind but concerned. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. Katherine hesitated. She barely knew this woman, but something about Eliza Parker inspired trust. Slowly, haltingly, she began to tell her story, how she'd met Thomas, their courtship, the early happy days of their marriage, and then his gradual descent into gambling and drinking. How he'd changed from charming to controlling, from attentive to abusive. And finally, how he'd sold her to the Silver Peak Mining Company to cover his debts. And then Marshal Dawson appeared, like something out of a storybook, Katherine concluded, still amazed by the turn of events. "He paid my debt and brought me back to Calico. He's arranging for a divorce." Eliza listened without interruption, her face showing compassion rather than the judgment Katherine had feared. When the story was finished, she reached across the table and squeezed Katherine's hand. "Jack Dawson is a good man," she said quietly. "One of the few truly good men I've known. What he did for you doesn't surprise me at all." "He told me about his sister," Katherine said. "Is that why he became a marshal?" Eliza nodded. "After Mary died, Jack made it his mission to help women in dangerous situations, especially in mining towns. He travels a circuit through California and Nevada, keeping an eye on places like Silver Peak. He didn't want anything in return," Katherine said, still marveling at this fact. "He saved me and asked for nothing." A knowing smile touched Eliza's lips. "That's Jack for you. Never expects anything in return for doing what's right." She stood, gathering their empty dishes. "Now, you should rest before dinner. You've had quite an ordeal." Katherine returned to her room, lying down on the bed with its clean, crisp sheets. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. Her life had been upended twice in the span of a week, first by Thomas's betrayal, then by the marshal's intervention. She didn't know what the future held. The money from her father's store would sustain her for a while, but eventually she would need to find work. She had some education, she could read and write well, knew basic arithmetic, and had helped her father with his accounts before his death. Perhaps she could find work as a teacher or a shop assistant. For now, though, she was safe. She had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and kind people looking out for her welfare. It was more than she'd had yesterday, and for that she was profoundly grateful. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was of blue eyes, steady and kind, looking at her with concern rather than desire or contempt. Marshal Jackson Dawson had asked for nothing in return for his help, but Katherine found herself hoping she would see him again soon. At precisely 6 o'clock, the bell over the front door chimed. Katherine, freshly rested and wearing the borrowed dress from Eliza, was helping set the table for dinner when Marshal Dawson arrived. He'd cleaned up since the morning, his dark hair still damp from washing, his clothes dust-free. He'd traded his badge and gun belt for a simpler attire of clean denims and a button-down shirt, though he still wore the same worn boots. "Right on time, Jack," Eliza called from the kitchen. "Have a seat at the table. Katherine, would you pour the water, please?" The marshal nodded to Katherine, a hint of awkwardness in his manner now that they were meeting in these more domestic circumstances. "Mrs. Turner, you're looking better." "Thanks to Mrs. Parker," Katherine said, returning his nod as she filled the water glasses. "And please call me Katherine." A small smile touched his lips. "Katherine, then." They were joined at the table by the boarding house's two other residents, Miss Abigail Jenkins, a spinster schoolteacher in her 30s with a quick wit and sparkling eyes, and Mrs. Ruth Cooper, a young widow whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous year. Both women welcomed Katherine warmly, making no mention of the circumstances that had brought her to Mrs. Parker's door. Dinner was a pleasant affair: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and early summer vegetables from Eliza's garden. The conversation flowed easily, with the women doing most of the talking while Marshal Dawson listened more than he spoke. Katherine found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in years at Miss Jenkins' stories of her students' antics. After the meal, Mrs. Cooper and Miss Jenkins excused themselves, one to write letters, the other to prepare lessons for the next day. Eliza began clearing the table, waving away Katherine's offer to help. "You two go sit in the parlor," she said with a meaningful glance at the marshal. "Jack has news about your situation, Katherine." In the parlor, Katherine perched on the edge of a chair while the marshal stood awkwardly before taking a seat opposite her. The evening light streamed through the lace curtains, catching the dust motes in the air and illuminating half of his face while leaving the other in shadow. "I've spoken with Judge Wilson," he began without preamble. "He's agreed to expedite your divorce proceedings. Given the circumstances and the evidence, he believes it can be resolved quickly." Katherine clasped her hands tightly in her lap. How quickly? A week, perhaps 2. "The judge is currently in San Bernardino but will return to Calico next Tuesday." He paused, watching her reaction. "You'll need to appear before him to give testimony, but it should be straightforward. And Thomas will also be required to appear. If he refuses, the judge will proceed without him." The marshal's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Turner won't contest the divorce, I've made sure of that." Katherine didn't ask what methods of persuasion he had used. She was simply grateful for his intervention. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done." Marshal Dawson looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing more than you deserve," he said, then changed the subject. "Have you thought about what you'll do after? Do you plan to stay in Calico?" Katherine hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead yet. "I'm not sure. There are memories here, not all of them pleasant, but I don't know where else I would go." The marshal nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been thinking. "Calico's growing. They need people with skills. Eliza mentioned you can read and write, do figures." "Yes, my father taught me. I helped with his store before he died. The general store is looking for help. So is the assay office. They need someone who can keep records, someone trustworthy." He offered this information casually, but Katherine sensed he'd already made inquiries on her behalf. "You think they would hire me?" A woman in the middle of a divorce scandal. The marshal's blue eyes met hers directly. "I think they would hire a capable woman with references from the town marshal and the most respected widow in Calico." Katherine felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, hope, and something else she couldn't quite name. This man, who owed her nothing, continued to go out of his way to ensure her welfare. "Why?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why do all this for me?" For a long moment he didn't answer. When he did, his voice was low and thoughtful. "When I found my sister in that mining camp, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said the worst part wasn't the work or even the men. It was feeling that she wasn't a person anymore, just a thing to be used and discarded." He looked down at his hands, strong hands that Katherine now knew could be gentle despite their power. No one should feel that way, ever. He looked up, meeting her eyes again. "You're not just someone to be saved, Katherine. You're someone worth saving." The simple truth of his words struck her deeply. For years, Thomas had made her feel worthless, invisible except when he wanted something from her. In just one day, this quiet marshal had made her feel more valued than she had in as long as she could remember. Before she could respond, Eliza bustled into the parlor with a tray holding a pot of coffee and 3 cups. "Thought we could use something warm," she said, setting the tray on a small table. "It's turning chilly out there." The moment broken, Katherine and the marshal accepted their coffee. The conversation turned to more general topics: the weather, news from the mining operations, gossip from town. Yet Katherine was aware of a subtle shift between herself and the marshal, as if his words had opened a door between them that hadn't existed before. As the evening drew to a close, Marshal Dawson rose to leave. "I should be going. I've got an early start tomorrow, riding out to check on some claims north of town." "When will you return?" Eliza asked, walking him to the door. "Day after tomorrow, likely," he replied, settling his hat on his head. He turned to Katherine, who had followed them to the entryway. "If you need anything before then, Sheriff Miller knows where to find me." "Thank you," Katherine said, "for the coffee and the conversation." A small smile touched his lips, warming his eyes. "It was my pleasure, Katherine. Good night." After he left, Eliza gave Katherine a speculative look. "Jack Dawson doesn't usually stay for coffee," she remarked, "or talk as much as he did tonight." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "He was just being kind." "MMM." Eliza hummed noncommittally, but there was a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Well, whatever his reasons, it's good to see him taking an interest in something besides his work. That man carries too much on his shoulders." As Katherine prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about the marshal's words. "You're someone worth saving." After years of being made to feel worthless by Thomas, the simple affirmation of her value as a person felt revolutionary. She stared out her window at the stars above Calico, brighter here than they had been in the dirty air of the mining camp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would need to look for work, prepare for the divorce hearing, figure out how to build a life for herself from the ashes of her marriage. But for the first time in a very long time, Katherine Turner felt something like hope stirring in her heart. And if her thoughts kept returning to a pair of kind blue eyes and a deep voice that spoke truths she needed to hear, well, that was her secret to keep. The next week passed in a blur of activity for Katherine. True to his word, Marshal Dawson had spoken to several businesses in town about potential employment. By Thursday, she had secured a position at the assay office, working 3 days a week recording transactions and maintaining the ledgers. The pay was modest but fair, and the work was clean and respectable, a far cry from what would have awaited her at Silver Peak. Katherine settled into a routine at Mrs. Parker's boarding house, helping with meals and chores when she wasn't working. She found unexpected friendship with Miss Jenkins and Mrs. Cooper, neither of whom judged her for her failed marriage or the scandal of her near enslavement. For the first time in years, she felt part of a community of women who supported rather than competed with each other. She saw Marshal Dawson only occasionally during that week. He was busy with his duties, riding out to check on outlying settlements and mines, mediating disputes, and keeping the peace in a territory where law was still more ideal than reality. When their paths did cross at the general store, on the street, once at the assay office when he brought in a sample for testing, he was unfailingly polite but somewhat reserved. Katherine found herself watching for him, her heart beating a little faster when he appeared, disappointment settling in her chest when days passed without a glimpse of him. She told herself it was natural to feel connected to the man who had saved her from a terrible fate, but deep down, she knew it was more than gratitude that made her pulse quicken when she saw him. The day of her divorce hearing arrived sunny and clear. Katherine dressed carefully in her best outfit, a navy blue skirt and white blouse that Eliza had helped her alter from Mrs. Cooper's cast-offs. She pinned her hair up neatly and wore the small silver locket that contained her mother's keepsakes. Eliza walked with her to the courthouse, a newly constructed building on the edge of town that served as both judicial center and town hall. "You'll do fine," she assured Katherine, squeezing her hand. "Just tell the truth. Judge Wilson is fair and the law is on your side." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Katherine had imagined, just a large room with rows of benches, a raised platform where the judge would sit, and tables for the parties involved. Marshal Dawson was already there, speaking quietly with a distinguished-looking older man whom Katherine assumed was the judge. He looked up as she entered, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Katherine," he said, coming to her side, "this is Judge Wilson. He's agreed to hear your case first thing this morning." Judge Wilson was a tall, thin man with a neat white beard and piercing gray eyes. He nodded to Katherine with a kindly expression. "Mrs. Turner, I've reviewed the documents submitted by Marshal Dawson. Most disturbing situation. We'll get this resolved as quickly as possible." "Thank you, Your Honor," Katherine said, relieved by his matter-of-fact manner. The door opened again, and Thomas entered, escorted by Sheriff Miller. Katherine's former husband looked diminished somehow. His clothes were clean but wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. He glared at Katherine but said nothing as he was directed to a seat far from her. The hearing itself was mercifully brief. Judge Wilson established the facts of the case: Thomas's debts, his sale of Katherine to the Silver Peak Mining Company, the physical abuse she had suffered. The bill of sale that Marshal Dawson had obtained served as primary evidence, along with Katherine's testimony and the still fading bruises on her wrists. Thomas offered little defense, merely muttering that a man had rights over his wife and property. When Judge Wilson asked if he contested the divorce, he shrugged sullenly. "She's damaged goods now anyway," he said, his voice slurred even at this early hour. "Let her go." Katherine felt a stab of pain at his words, not because she still cared for him, but because she had once believed he loved her. Beside her, she felt Marshal Dawson tense, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. She reached over impulsively, touching his arm lightly. He glanced at her, his eyes dark with anger, but he took a deep breath and relaxed his hand. "The court finds clear grounds for divorce," Judge Wilson announced, his voice carrying through the small room. "The bonds of matrimony between Thomas Turner and Katherine Turner are hereby dissolved. Mrs. Turner shall revert to her maiden name if she so chooses." Katherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Tate," she said clearly. "My maiden name is Tate." Judge Wilson nodded, "So noted." Given the circumstances of Mr. Turner's treatment of his wife and the illegal nature of his attempt to indenture her to the mining company, the court further orders that all property brought to the marriage by Katherine Tate be returned to her, along with a compensatory sum of $50. Thomas started to protest, but a sharp look from Sheriff Miller silenced him. "This court is adjourned," Judge Wilson declared, rapping his gavel once. It was over. Just like that, Katherine was free. She sat for a moment, letting the reality sink in. She was no longer Katherine Turner, wife of a gambler and drunkard. She was Katherine Tate again, a woman with her own name, her own life, her own future. "Are you all right?" Marshal Dawson asked quietly, his blue eyes concerned as he studied her face. Katherine nodded, a smile breaking across her face like sunshine after rain. "Yes, better than all right." Outside the courthouse, Eliza was waiting anxiously. When Katherine emerged, she rushed forward. "Well, what happened? It's done," Katherine said, still hardly believing it herself. "I'm divorced. I'm Katherine Tate again." Eliza embraced her warmly. "Wonderful news. We should celebrate. Dinner at the boarding house tonight. I'll make your favorite apple pie." Katherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "That sounds perfect." Marshal Dawson followed them down the courthouse steps. "I need to speak with Sheriff Miller about another matter," he said, "but I wanted to make sure you were settled first." "Will you join us for dinner tonight, Jack?" Eliza asked, a small celebration for Katherine's new beginning. The marshal hesitated, looking at Katherine. "If you're sure I wouldn't be intruding." "I would very much like you to be there," Katherine said honestly. "None of this would have been possible without you." Something flickered in his eyes, pleasure, perhaps, or something deeper. "Then I'd be honored to join you." 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock, Eliza confirmed with a satisfied nod. As they parted ways, Katherine felt a curious mix of emotions. Relief at the end of her marriage, pride in having stood up for herself, gratitude toward those who had helped her. And beneath it all, a growing awareness of her feelings for the quiet marshal who had changed her life. She was free now, free to build a new life, make her own choices, follow her own heart. And for the first time in a very long time, Katherine Tate was looking forward to the future. The celebration dinner at Mrs. Parker's boarding house was a warm, joyful affair. The table was set with the best china, flowers from the garden brightened the center, and the smells of roast beef and fresh baked bread filled the house. Miss Jenkins and Mrs. Cooper had decorated the parlor with paper streamers, and someone Katherine suspected, Eliza, had hung a hand-lettered sign that read, "Congratulations, Katherine Tate." The gesture brought tears to Katherine's eyes. These women, who had known her for such a short time, had embraced her as one of their own, celebrating her freedom as if it were a birth or a wedding, a true new beginning. Marshal Dawson arrived precisely at 6, having traded his work clothes for clean denims and a pressed shirt. He'd even polished his boots, Katherine noticed with a small smile. In his hands was a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "For you," he said, presenting it to Katherine somewhat awkwardly, "a small gift to mark the occasion." Katherine was touched and surprised. "You didn't need to bring anything," she said, carefully untying the string. Inside the package was a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a simple pattern of leaves and vines. "I noticed you like to write," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "Eliza mentioned you keep notes and such, thought you might like a proper place to put your thoughts." It was such a personal, thoughtful gift that Katherine felt her heart swell. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Thank you, Marshal Jack," he corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think you can call me Jack." Their eyes met, and Katherine felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "Jack," she repeated softly. The moment was interrupted by Eliza announcing that dinner was ready. Throughout the meal, Katherine was acutely aware of Jack's presence across the table. He spoke more than usual, sharing stories from his travels that had the women laughing and asking questions. Katherine noticed how his eyes often found hers, how his rare smile seemed to appear most often in response to something she said. After dinner, as Eliza served her promised apple pie, the conversation turned to Katherine's plans for the future. "Will you stay in Calico now that your position is settled?" Miss Jenkins asked. Katherine nodded. "For the time being, yes. My job at the assay office is going well, and I've just regained my freedom. I'm not in any hurry to make big changes." "Smart," Mrs. Cooper approved. "Take your time, find your feet. There's no rush to decide everything at once. And you're welcome here as long as you need a place to stay," Eliza added warmly. "Though I expect a young woman like you will be setting up your own household before too long." Katherine caught the hint of matchmaking in Eliza's tone and felt her cheeks warm. "That's kind of you, but I'm not looking for another husband. My experience with marriage has been less than encouraging." "Not all men are like Thomas Turner," Eliza said, with a significant glance at Jack, who seemed suddenly very interested in his pie. "Eliza, don't embarrass the poor girl," Miss Jenkins chided, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. "Or the Marshal, for that matter." Jack cleared his throat. "Speaking of my duties," he said, clearly eager to change the subject, "I'll be heading out on circuit again tomorrow. There's been some trouble at the mines near Barstow that needs attention." Katherine felt a pang of disappointment. "How long will you be gone?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, he replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "Depends on what I find there." The evening wound down shortly after that announcement. Miss Jenkins and Mrs. Cooper excused themselves to their rooms, and Eliza began clearing the table, waving away offers of help from both Katherine and Jack. "You two go sit in the parlor," she instructed. "I'm sure the Marshal wants to say a proper goodbye before his journey." In the parlor, Katherine found herself suddenly shy. Jack stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading daylight. She joined him there, looking out at the quiet street where a few townspeople still moved about their evening business. "Thank you again for the journal," she said. "It's a perfect gift. I'm glad you like it." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Katherine, I wanted to make sure you'll be all right while I'm gone. If Turner causes any trouble, Sheriff Miller will handle it, but if there's anything else you need—" "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I have work, a place to stay, new friends. You've done more than enough for me already." He shook his head. "It doesn't feel like enough." "Why not?" Jack hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "When I found you at that mining camp, something about you, I can't explain it. I just knew I had to help. Not just because of my sister, or because it was the right thing to do, but because—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to articulate his thoughts. "Because," Katherine prompted gently. "Because I've never met anyone like you," he finally said, his voice low and earnest. "Someone who could endure what you did and still have such strength, such kindness in your eyes." Katherine's heart began to race. "Jack, I know it's too soon," he continued quickly. "You've just gained your freedom. The last thing you need is another man making claims on your time or attention. I respect that. I just wanted you to know that I care what happens to you. More than I should, perhaps." The simple honesty of his words touched Katherine deeply. This man, who had asked for nothing in return for saving her, was now offering her something precious: his regard, his concern, perhaps even his heart. "When you return from your circuit," she said carefully, "I would very much like to hear about your travels. Perhaps we could take a walk or have coffee somewhere that isn't Mrs. Parker's parlor." Hope flickered in his blue eyes. "I'd like that. So would I." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. "I should go," Jack finally said. "Early start tomorrow." Katherine nodded, walking with him to the door. At the threshold, he turned to her once more. "Take care of yourself, Katherine Tate," he said softly. "You too, Marshal Dawson," she replied with a small smile. "Come back safely." After he left, Katherine stood at the door for a long moment, her mind replaying their conversation. When she finally turned back to the parlor, she found Eliza watching her with a knowing smile. "That man is sweet on you," the older woman said matter-of-factly. "Has been since the day he brought you here." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "It's not like that, he just feels responsible for me." "MMHMM," Eliza hummed skeptically. "And I suppose that's why he polished his boots and bought you a gift, because he feels responsible." Katherine couldn't help but smile at Eliza's teasing. "It's complicated. I've just ended one disastrous relationship. I'm not sure I'm ready for another." Eliza's expression softened. "Of course you're not, dear, and Jack knows that. He's a patient man. He'll wait until you're ready, if you ever are." She patted Katherine's hand. "Just don't close your heart completely. Not all men are like Thomas. Some, like our Marshal, are worth taking a chance on." That night, lying in bed, Katherine opened her new journal. The blank pages seemed to hold infinite possibilities. After a moment's thought, she began to write, her pen moving steadily across the paper. "Today, I became Katherine Tate again. Not Thomas Turner's wife, not a possession to be sold, but a woman with her own name, her own life. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in years, I'm not afraid to find out." The days passed slowly without Jack's presence in Calico. Katherine threw herself into her work at the assay office, learning the business quickly and earning praise from her employer. In the evenings, she helped Eliza with the boarding house, read books borrowed from Miss Jenkins, and wrote in her journal. She was building a life, a simple one, but her own. Thomas had left town, as ordered by Judge Wilson. Katherine heard rumors that he'd headed to Nevada, chasing stories of new silver strikes. She found she cared less with each passing day, the memory of their marriage fading like a bad dream in the morning light. 2 weeks after Jack's departure, Katherine was walking home from the assay office when she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats on the main street. Her heart quickened as she turned to see Jack riding into town, dust-covered and weary-looking but whole. Their eyes met across the distance, and he lifted a hand in greeting. Katherine smiled and nodded in return, suddenly shy. He continued toward the sheriff's office, and she resumed her walk to the boarding house, wondering if he would call on her that evening. By 6 o'clock, there was still no sign of him. Katherine tried not to feel disappointed as she helped Eliza prepare dinner. He had just returned from a long journey, after all. He likely had reports to file, business to attend to. Just as they were sitting down to eat, a knock came at the door. Eliza went to answer it, returning with a small envelope that she handed to Katherine. "From the Marshal," she said with a twinkle in her eye. Katherine opened it, finding a brief note inside. "Katherine, would you join me for a walk tomorrow evening at sunset? I'll call for you at the boarding house." Jack, simple and direct, like the man himself. Katherine couldn't help the smile that spread across her face as she tucked the note into her pocket. "Good news?" Miss Jenkins asked innocently, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Marshal Dawson has invited me for a walk tomorrow evening," Katherine said, trying to sound casual despite the flutter in her stomach. "How lovely," Eliza said approvingly. "The weather is supposed to be perfect tomorrow." The next day passed in a blur of anticipation for Katherine. She found herself watching the clock, counting the hours until sunset. When she returned to the boarding house from work, she took extra care with her appearance, washing her hair and choosing a light blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. "You look beautiful," Eliza said as Katherine descended the stairs. "The Marshal won't know what hit him." Katherine laughed nervously. "It's just a walk, Eliza." "Of course it is, dear," the older woman replied with a knowing smile. At precisely the appointed time, Jack arrived at the boarding house. He too had made an effort with his appearance. His clothes were freshly cleaned, his dark hair neatly combed, and he'd shaved his usual stubble. In his hand was a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, presenting them to Katherine. "Picked them on the way into town yesterday." Katherine accepted the flowers with a smile. "They're lovely, thank you." After saying goodbye to Eliza, who was trying and failing to hide her delight at the situation, Katherine and Jack set out into the evening. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden glow over Calico that softened the rough edges of the mining town. They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, leaving the busier streets behind and heading toward a small rise that overlooked the town. The path was well worn but not difficult, and Katherine found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of walking beside Jack, their arms occasionally brushing. "How was your journey?" she finally asked. "Did you resolve the trouble in Barstow?" Jack nodded. "Claim jumpers trying to take over a small operation. Nothing too serious, but it could have turned ugly if left unchecked." "Were you in danger?" Katherine couldn't help asking, concern coloring her voice. A small smile touched his lips. "Nothing I couldn't handle. Most trouble out here can be settled without violence if you catch it early enough." They reached the top of the rise, where a flat rock formation provided a natural bench overlooking the valley. The view was spectacular. Calico spread out below them, the desert stretching beyond, painted in shades of gold and purple by the setting sun. "It's beautiful," Katherine said, sitting on the rock. "I've never seen it from up here before." "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Jack admitted, sitting beside her but leaving a respectful distance between them. "Helps put things in perspective." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Katherine was acutely aware of Jack beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "I missed you," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "While I was away." Katherine's heart fluttered. "I missed you too," she admitted. "Calico seemed different without you here." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. "Katherine, I meant what I said before I left. I care about you more than I should, perhaps, but I don't want to rush you or press my attentions where they might not be wanted." "They're not unwanted," Katherine said softly, meeting his gaze. "But yes, it's soon. 3 weeks ago I was still married, still trapped. Everything has changed so quickly." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just a chance to know you better, to see if there might be something worth pursuing between us." Katherine thought about Thomas, how his charm had concealed his true nature, how quickly their marriage had turned from dream to nightmare. but Jack was different. He had proven his character not through words but through actions, through the respect he showed her and others, through his unwavering integrity. "I would like that," she said finally, "to see where this might lead, but slowly, Jack, I need time." "Time is something I can give," he replied, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'm not going anywhere, Katherine." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink, Katherine felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, uncertainty didn't frighten her. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, making her own choices. And if those choices led her toward the quiet, honorable man sitting beside her, watching the sunset with contentment in his eyes, well, perhaps that wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. Over the next 3 months, Katherine's life fell into a pleasant rhythm. Her work at the assay office continued to go well, with her employer increasingly relying on her organizational skills and attention to detail. She had moved from the boarding house into a small rented room above the dressmaker's shop, giving her more independence while still keeping her close to Eliza and her other friends. And then there was Jack. True to his word, he took things slowly, respectful of Katherine's need for time and space. When he was in Calico, they spent time together taking walks, sharing meals, sometimes just sitting together in comfortable silence while Katherine Reed and Jack cleaned his gear or whittled small wooden figures, a hobby she hadn't known he enjoyed. When his duties took him away from town, he wrote to her simple, straightforward letters describing the places he visited, the people he met, the problems he resolved. Katherine saved every one, rereading them in the evenings by lamplight, getting to know this quiet man through his written words. Slowly, cautiously, Katherine found herself opening her heart again. Jack Dawson was unlike any man she had known, steady where Thomas had been volatile, honest where Thomas had been deceptive, kind where Thomas had been cruel. He never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like she owed him anything for the kindness he had shown her. It was on a crisp autumn evening when Katherine realized she was falling in love with him. They were walking back from dinner at the hotel, the stars brilliant overhead, when Jack stopped to help an elderly miner who had stumbled on the uneven boardwalk. The simple kindness of the gesture, the gentle way Jack steadied the old man and made sure he was all right before continuing their walk, it suddenly crystallized for Katherine what had been growing in her heart for months. She loved this man with his quiet strength and unwavering decency. Loved how he treated everyone with respect, whether they were the town's wealthiest citizens or its humblest workers. Loved his dry humor that emerged when he was truly comfortable, his passion for justice that drove him to ride endless miles in all weather, his hands that could be so gentle despite their strength. The realization both thrilled and frightened her. After Thomas, she had sworn she would never give another man power over her heart. But Jack had never sought power, only connection, understanding, the chance to know and be known. A week later, Jack received orders that would take him away from Calico for at least a month. A series of robberies along the route to San Bernardino needed investigation, and as one of the most experienced marshals in the territory, he had been assigned to the case. The night before his departure, they walked to their usual spot overlooking the town. The evening was cool, and Jack had brought a blanket for them to sit on. As they watched the lights of Calico twinkling below, Katherine gathered her courage. "I'll miss you," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Jack looked at her, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "I'll miss you too, more than I can say." Katherine took a deep breath. "Jack, these past months, getting to know you, spending time with you, it's meant everything to me." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "Katherine, please let me finish," she said softly. "When you found me at that mining camp, I didn't think I would ever trust a man again. Thomas had destroyed that part of me, or so I thought." Jack listened silently, his eyes never leaving her face. "But you," Katherine continued, "you showed me that not all men are like him." That there are good men in this world, men of honor and kindness and integrity. She squeezed his hand. You never asked for anything in return for helping me. You gave me time and space when I needed it. You respected my boundaries, and in doing so, you helped me find my way back to myself. Katherine, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion, you did that yourself. You're the strongest person I know. She shook her head, smiling through the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. Maybe, but you believed in that strength when I couldn't see it myself. She took another deep breath. What I'm trying to say, Jack Dawson, is that I've fallen in love with you. For a moment he seemed frozen, his eyes wide with surprise. Then, with exquisite gentleness, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. I've loved you since the moment I saw you in that wagon, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I told myself it was just concern, just duty, but I knew better. I knew you were someone special, Catherine Tate. Catherine leaned into his touch, her heart full to bursting. I was so afraid, she admitted, afraid to trust again, to be vulnerable again. I know, he said softly, and I will spend every day proving that your trust is not misplaced, if you'll let me. In answer, Catherine leaned forward and kissed him a gentle, tentative touch of lips that quickly deepened as Jack responded, his arms encircling her with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they finally broke apart, Jack rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I don't want to leave tomorrow, he murmured. But you have to, Catherine said, understanding. It's who you are, Jack. I wouldn't change that about you. He pulled back slightly to look at her, his expression serious. When I return, Catherine, I want to court you properly, if that's what you want to. Catherine smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. I would like that very much, Marshal Dawson. Under the vast canopy of stars, with the lights of Calico twinkling below like earthbound reflections of the heavens, Jack and Catherine sealed their understanding with another kiss, a promise of what was to come when duty had been fulfilled, and he returned to the woman who had captured his heart. The month of Jack's absence stretched longer than Catherine had anticipated. The robbery investigation proved more complex than expected, with the trail leading from San Bernardino all the way to Los Angeles and back again. His letters came regularly, each one treasured, but they were a poor substitute for his presence. Catherine kept busy with work and friends, but the hollow ache of missing him never quite subsided. She found herself watching the road into town each evening, hoping to see his familiar figure riding toward Calico. It was nearly 6 weeks after his departure when Catherine, working late at the assay office, heard a commotion outside. Looking up from her ledgers, she saw people gathering in the street, pointing toward the road from San Bernardino. Her heart leaped. Jack must be returning at last. She quickly put away her work and stepped outside, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. A group of riders was indeed approaching, but as they drew closer, she could see something was wrong. They were moving too slowly, and one horse appeared to be carrying a double burden. Fear clutched at Catherine's heart as she moved toward the gathering crowd. Sheriff Miller was there, his expression grim as he watched the approaching riders. "What's happening?" Catherine asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The sheriff glanced at her, his face softening with sympathy. "Posse coming back from San Bernardino way. Looks like they've got wounded." Before Catherine could ask more, the riders reached the edge of town. Now she could see clearly what had caused the slow pace. Jack was slumped in the saddle of the lead horse, supported by another man riding behind him. His shirt was dark with what could only be blood, his face pale and drawn with pain. "Jack," Catherine cried, pushing through the crowd toward him, his head lifted at the sound of her voice, his eyes finding hers. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before pain overtook it. "Miss Tate," one of the riders acknowledged her, a deputy she recognized from San Bernardino. Marshal took a bullet breaking up the robbery gang. Doc patched him up best he could, but he insisted on getting back to Calico. "He needs to get to the doctor," Catherine said firmly, pushing aside her panic. Now, the next hours were a blur of activity. Doctor Morgan, Calico's aging physician, determined that Jack's wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. The bullet had torn through his side, missing vital organs but causing significant blood loss and the risk of infection. "He's a lucky man," the doctor told Catherine as they sat in his small waiting room. "An inch to the left and we'd be having a very different conversation." "Will he recover?" Catherine asked, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "With proper care and rest, yes." The doctor's shrewd eyes studied her face. "He's been asking for you, says he has something important to tell you that can't wait." Catherine's heart skipped. "Can I see him, briefly?" Dr. Morgan cautioned. "He needs rest more than conversation, but I suspect he'll rest better after seeing you." Jack was lying on a narrow bed in the doctor's back room, his torso wrapped in white bandages, his face alarmingly pale against the pillows. When Catherine entered, his eyes opened immediately, focusing on her with an intensity that took her breath away. "Catherine," he said, his voice weak but determined. "You're here." She moved to his side, taking his hand carefully to avoid disturbing the bandages. "Of course I'm here. Where else would I be when you ride into town half dead?" A small smile touched his lips. "Not half dead, just a scratch." "A scratch that nearly killed you," she corrected, tears threatening. "Jack Dawson, if you ever frighten me like this again, marry me," he interrupted, his blue eyes fixed on hers with fierce determination. Catherine froze, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, squeezing her hand weakly. "I had it all planned, was going to court you properly when I got back, take my time doing things right, but lying there in San Bernardino, not knowing if I'd make it back to you. I realized time isn't guaranteed, Catherine." "Jack, I love you," he continued, as if afraid he wouldn't get another chance to say it. "I've loved you since I first saw you, and I'll love you until my last breath. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears spilled onto Catherine's cheeks. "You can't propose to me like this," she protested weakly. "You're injured, probably delirious from blood loss. Never been more clear-headed in my life," Jack insisted. "I almost died without telling you how much you mean to me. I won't make that mistake again." His eyes searched hers. "If you need time to think about it, yes," Catherine interrupted, her heart too full to contain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jack Dawson." His face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away despite his weakened state. "You're sure? I'm not exactly in peak condition at the moment." Catherine laughed through her tears, leaning down to kiss him gently. "I'm sure. I love you, Jack. I want to build that life with you too." Dr. Morgan cleared his throat from the doorway. "As touching as this is, my patient needs rest." "You can continue your romantic declarations tomorrow, Miss Tate." Catherine straightened, wiping her eyes but unable to stop smiling. "I'll be back first thing in the morning," she promised Jack. "I'll be waiting," he replied, his eyes already drooping with exhaustion. "Don't change your mind overnight." "Never," Catherine assured him, pressing a final kiss to his forehead before allowing Dr. Morgan to usher her out. As she walked back to her room under the star-filled sky, Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness settle in her heart. 6 months ago, she had been a possession to be sold by one man and bought by another. Now she was a woman making her own choice, following her own heart toward a future with a man who saw her not as property but as a partner. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Jack's job would always carry risks, and the scars of her past with Thomas wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time since she was a girl, Catherine felt truly hopeful about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the woman who had reclaimed her freedom, and the man who had asked for nothing but her heart in return. The wedding of Marshal Jackson Dawson and Miss Katherine Tate took place on a clear spring day, 6 months after his proposal and full recovery. The ceremony was held in Calico's small church, filled to capacity with townspeople who had watched their courtship with interest and approval. Catherine wore a simple but elegant ivory dress that Mrs. Cooper and Eliza had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs and tiny pearl buttons down the back. Her auburn hair was swept up with sprigs of desert flowers, and around her neck hung the silver locket that had survived her darkest days. Jack waited for her at the altar in a new black suit, his badge polished and pinned to his lapel, his usually serious face transformed by joy as Katherine walked toward him on Sheriff Miller's arm. The older man had offered to give her away in the absence of family, a gesture that had brought tears to Katherine's eyes when he suggested it. "You look beautiful," Jack whispered when she reached his side, his blue eyes drinking her in as if memorizing every detail. "So do you," she replied with a smile, taking his offered hand. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the elderly Reverend Walsh speaking of commitment, partnership, and the sacred bonds of matrimony. When it came time for their vows, Jack's strong voice filled the church with promises Katherine knew he would keep until his dying day. When her turn came, she spoke clearly and confidently, leaving behind the last shadows of her first marriage as she pledged herself to this good man who had saved her in more ways than one. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Walsh declared, beaming at the couple. "You may kiss your bride, Marshal." Jack didn't hesitate, drawing Katherine into a kiss that managed to be both proper enough for church and passionate enough to bring a blush to her cheeks and cheers from the congregation. The celebration afterward was held at Eliza's boarding house, the garden transformed with lanterns, flowers, and tables laden with food contributed by half the town. Katherine moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and good wishes, her hand rarely leaving Jack's as they shared their happiness with friends and neighbors. "Mrs. Dawson," Eliza said, approaching with a glass of punch for the bride. "How does it feel?" Katherine smiled, the name still new but already dear. "Wonderful," she said honestly, "like coming home." Eliza patted her cheek affectionately. "I knew from the moment he brought you to my door that this day would come. Some things are just meant to be." As the celebration continued into the evening, Jack drew Katherine aside to a quiet corner of the garden. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she assured him, resting her hands on his chest. "And you?" "I have everything I never knew I wanted," he said softly, kissing her forehead. "A beautiful wife, good friends, a community that feels like home." Katherine smiled up at him. "And dangerous criminals to chase," Jack laughed, the sound still rare enough to delight her. "Well, that too. But I've requested a change in my duties. Less traveling, more time in and around Calico." "Jack, you didn't have to do that," Katherine protested. "I know how important your work is. You're more important," he said simply. "Besides, there's plenty of work for a marshal here. The territory's growing and Calico with it." Katherine studied his face, finding no regret or hesitation in his eyes. "As long as you're sure, I never want to be the reason you give up something you love." "The only thing I love that I'm not giving up is you," Jack assured her. "And speaking of things we love," he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope, handing it to Katherine. "What's this?" she asked, opening it curiously. Inside was a deed to a piece of property just outside Calico, an acre of land with a small but sturdy house that had recently been built by a miner who'd struck it rich and moved to San Francisco. "Our home," Jack said, watching her face. "If you like it." "I didn't want to presume, but I thought you might prefer our own place to my rooms above the jail or your room above the shop." Katherine stared at the deed, then at her husband, her heart so full it might burst. "You bought us a house when, last month, when the Ferguson place went up for sale. I've been fixing it up in my spare time, new roof, fresh paint. Eliza helped me choose curtains and such." "So that's where you've been disappearing to," Katherine said, understanding dawning. "I thought you were working on a case." Jack looked slightly sheepish. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "We can see it tomorrow if you'd like. If you don't care for it, we can find something else." Katherine threw her arms around his neck, the deed clutched tightly in one hand. "I love you, Jackson Dawson," she said fervently, "and I'm sure I'll love our home." As the night drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Jack and Katherine slipped away, walking hand in hand through the quiet streets of Calico toward the hotel where they would spend their wedding night. Tomorrow would bring their new home, new challenges, the beginning of their life together. Katherine looked up at the stars, bright and endless above the desert town. A year ago, she had been trapped in a loveless marriage, her future determined by a husband who saw her as property. Now she walked beside a man who had asked for nothing but freely given everything: respect, kindness, love, a home, a future. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked, noticing her upturned face. Katherine smiled, squeezing his hand. "That sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest light. If Thomas hadn't sold me to that mining camp, we might never have met," Jack finished, pulling her closer to his side. "Though I'd prefer you'd been spared that ordeal." "So would I," Katherine admitted, "but I can't regret where it led me." She stopped walking, turning to face him in the moonlight. "To you, Jack. To this moment, this life we're building together." Jack's eyes were tender as he cupped her face in his hands. "I promise you, Katherine Dawson, that you will never again be treated as anything less than the treasure you are." "Not while I draw breath." Katherine believed him with every fiber of her being. This man, who had bought her freedom and asked for nothing in return, had given her the greatest gift of all: a love built on respect, trust, and the knowledge that whatever came their way, they would face it together. As Jack lowered his lips to hers under the vast desert sky, Katherine knew that she had finally found where she belonged, not as a possession to be bought and sold, but as a woman cherished for herself, standing side by side with the man who had seen her value when she had forgotten it herself. 5 years later, the Dawson homestead was barely recognizable from the modest house Jack had purchased as a wedding gift. The building had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, with a new kitchen, a larger parlor, and 3 bedrooms. A sturdy barn stood nearby, housing 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens. A vegetable garden flourished beside the house, and young fruit trees not yet bearing but full of promise lined the path to the front door. On the wide front porch, Katherine sat in a rocking chair, watching as Jack chased their 3-year-old son, little Thomas, around the yard. The boy's delighted squeals filled the air as he dodged his father's playful attempts to catch him. Nearby, their 1-year-old daughter, Mary, named for Jack's sister, sat on a blanket, solemnly stacking wooden blocks only to knock them down with gleeful abandon. Katherine's hand rested on her swollen belly, where their 3rd child had been making his or her presence known with increasingly vigorous kicks. Just a few more weeks, Dr. Morgan had told her yesterday, and their family would grow again. As she watched her husband and children, Katherine's mind drifted back over the past 5 years. They had been good years, filled with more joy than she had ever thought possible and blessedly free of the kind of strife that had characterized her first marriage. Jack had kept his promise to stay closer to home, accepting the position of permanent marshal for Calico and the surrounding territory. He still had to ride out occasionally to handle problems in outlying areas, but he was home most nights, a steady presence in their children's lives and a devoted husband to Katherine. Katherine had continued working at the assay office until Thomas was born, then had found ways to contribute from home, keeping books for several businesses in town, writing articles for the Calico Chronicle, and even publishing a small volume of poems about desert life that had sold surprisingly well in San Bernardino and beyond. Thomas Turner had never returned to Calico. They'd heard he died in a bar fight in Nevada 2 years after the divorce, a sad end that had left Katherine feeling not vindictive satisfaction, but a quiet sorrow for the man who had never understood what truly mattered in life. The Silver Peak Mining Company had closed operations the year after Katherine's escape. The silver vein played out. Jack had made a point of riding out to ensure that all the workers, especially the women, were properly compensated and safely relocated. Blackwell, the mine owner who had accepted Thomas's deal, had moved on to other ventures elsewhere. "Mama, look," Thomas's excited voice pulled Katherine from her reflections. The boy had climbed onto his father's shoulders and was riding there triumphantly, his small hands buried in Jack's dark hair, now lightly threaded with silver at the temples. "I see you, sweetheart," Katherine called, smiling at the picture they made. "Be careful up there." "He's fine," Jack assured her, his hands securely holding their son's legs as he walked toward the porch. "Aren't you, Deputy?" "I'm being careful," Thomas agreed solemnly, though his grip on his father's hair suggested otherwise. Jack winced good-naturedly as he reached the porch, lifting Thomas from his shoulders and setting him on his feet. The boy immediately ran to his sister, dropping to his knees beside her blanket to help with the block tower. "How are you feeling?" Jack asked, leaning down to kiss Katherine's forehead. "Not too tired. I'm fine," she assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her belly where the baby was kicking. "Your son or daughter is practicing for a horse race, I think." Jack's face lit up with wonder, as it did every time he felt the baby move. Even after 2 children, the miracle of new life never ceased to amaze him. "Could be a future marshal," he suggested, crouching beside her chair to keep his hand on her belly. "Strong kick." "Or a future poet," Katherine countered with a smile. "With excellent rhythm." Jack laughed, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. At 43, he was as handsome as ever to Katherine's eyes, perhaps more so for the character the years had etched into his face. "As long as he or she is healthy, that's all that matters," he said, echoing the sentiment they'd shared with each pregnancy. Katherine nodded, covering his hand with hers. "Jack," she said thoughtfully, "do you ever think about that day at Silver Peak, when you found me in that wagon?" His expression grew serious. "Often. Why do you ask? I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out, if you hadn't been there that day, if you had ridden on without stopping." She shuddered slightly, despite the warm afternoon. Jack's hand tightened on hers. "I couldn't have ridden past," he said simply. "Not when I saw you there. Something inside me knew, Katherine, knew that you were important, that what happened to you mattered more than I could understand at the time." Katherine smiled, blinking back sudden tears. "My hero," she said softly, only half teasing. "The man who bought my freedom and asked for nothing in return." Jack stood, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms, careful of her pregnant belly between them. "I asked for nothing," he agreed, his voice low and intimate, "but I received everything." His blue eyes, still as clear and honest as the day they'd met, held hers. "You gave me a family, Katherine, a home, purpose, joy, more than I ever dreamed possible." Katherine leaned into his embrace, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "And you gave me back myself," she murmured. "When Thomas sold me, he took away more than my freedom. He took my sense of who I was, what I was worth." Jack's arms tightened around her. "You were always worth everything," he said fiercely. "Always." From the blanket, Mary let out a squeal as Thomas's tower of blocks collapsed. Both parents turned to watch as their son patiently began rebuilding, showing his sister how to place one block on another without toppling the structure. "We've built something good here," Katherine said, her voice full of quiet pride. "Something that will last." Jack pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We have, and we'll keep building it day by day, year by year." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across their homestead, Katherine felt a profound sense of contentment wash over her. The path that had led her here had not been easy or straight. There had been darkness, pain, moments when she had lost faith in herself and others. But standing here now, in the circle of her husband's arms, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together, Katherine knew she wouldn't change a single step of that journey. For it had led her here to this moment, this life, a life built on love freely given, respect deeply held, and a freedom more precious for having once been lost. In the distance, the silhouette of Calico's buildings stood against the reddening sky, the town where she had known both her greatest despair and her greatest joy. Katherine smiled as Jack's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "I love you, Jack Dawson," she said simply, the words carrying all the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future together. "And I love you, Katherine Dawson," he replied, his voice low and sure. "Today, tomorrow, always." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together on the porch of their home, surrounded by the family they had created, bound by a love that had begun when a marshal with kind eyes had looked at a woman in a wagon and seen not a commodity to be traded, but a soul worth saving, had bought her freedom, and asked for nothing in return, but had received everything his heart had ever desired.